This episode of Trifles is brought to you by listeners like you, who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the band was speckled and there were 6 Napoleons, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about why Dr. Watson was called James by his wife? Or of Sherlock Holmes's dining habits? Or what happened when he let a criminal escape?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 410, John Watson, Unreliable Narrator. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
Oh, I knew I could rely on you.
Yes you can. The old reliable.
I can almost set my watch by you.
Really? What time is it anyway?
It's 87:30. Wait, what? Maybe I can't set my watch by you.
The hairs on my wrist say it's 4:35, but what do they know?
Well, this is going to be an interesting episode, a little freewheeling. It was suggested to us by one of our listeners, JC. Thank you for this suggestion, JC. We'll be sending you a thank you gift in the mail. But JC said that basically there have been instances of Watson perhaps embellishing in his stories. And, maybe Holmes is taking issue with the way Watson decides to write. But is it also possible that Watson was, making some creative exaggerations to make the stories more exciting? What if he's actually stretching the facts a little bit? So that is what we are going to focus on this time around. A couple of housekeeping things. If you would like to support the show, we are available on Patreon and Substack. We have those options for you. Just go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com. Choose whichever mode works for you. We appreciate whatever amount you can put out there, but it helps with our research. It helps with the hosting costs, all the associated things that go into producing such a high-quality program as this one. And, of course, if you wouldn't mind leaving us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you can leave ratings for the show. Your approval, we're hoping it's your approval, helps other people to find the show, and, it just makes us feel good about what we do. It's a little disheartening sometimes when we do this and we don't get any feedback. We just assume we're doing fine. So if you want to tell us that too, we're okay with that. I should also note we had some listener mail from Max McGee regarding our recent episode when we went through that show and tell kind of thing where clients show up and present something or there's some kind of physical clue to refer to. And he said, The title of your recent episode on clues, artifacts, was somewhat of a boot and switch, it seems. I was hoping you'd mention Sir Henry Baskerville's boots. Perhaps I missed a passing reference. Mr. Mortimer's walking stick, but please don't call him doctor, is another favorite of mine, but from the Hound. It's one of my favorite lines in all the canon, the footprint of a gigantic hound. Honorable mention to the typo of plow, P-L-O-W for plow, P-L-O-U-G-H, and the 3 Garridebs, and my runner-up to the footprints above, the giant bowler hat and the goose from the Blue Carbuncle. Who cares about the pea-sized bauble? The hat provides my favorite Cluedo, and an enormously entertaining deduction session about its owner. And don't get me started on the differences between biscuits, crackers, scones, fireworks, crumpets, trumpets, and strumpets. Thank you for that, Max.
Yeah.
Goodness. Well, let's see what we give people to talk about this time around. Okay, Bert.
Yes.
We want to talk about Watson as an old reliable, or is it an old unreliable narrator?
Yeah, we sure do. Well, there's lots of reasons to question Watson's veracity. I mean, if you think about it, we spend a good deal of time questioning his memory and finding fault with it. He typically reports events that upon reflection do not seem to have occurred in the particular time period he specifies. He's names locations, the majority of which are hard to identify. He identifies houses and regions and parts of the country where there appears to be nothing to support it. He seems to wander all over the place, and we're very prone to giving him the benefit of the doubt by saying, oh, well, he was writing as quickly as he could. He couldn't read his own handwriting. He mislaid the notes. He relied on a third party, this, that, and the other thing. About all that we really know and trust about Watson, we find out in Study in Scarlet, when we understand him to be a survivor of the Battle of Maiwand, a very real battle. And he describes his journey back to England on a very real troop ship, and describes his pension and his loneliness, all of which sound extraordinarily, have proven to be, generally highly authentic. And there, we can sometimes part company with him.
Well, he obviously makes short work of his association with Sherlock Holmes in writing up that very first adventure they experienced together. And of course, it led to a second one in The Sign of Four. And this is interesting because this is one of the few times where we see this kind of inter-story connection, where Watson is being critiqued by Holmes. He says, Holmes says, my name figures in no newspaper. The work itself, the pleasure of finding a feel for my particular powers, is my highest reward. But you have yourself had some experience of my methods of work in the Jefferson Hope case. Oh, yes, indeed, said I cordially. I was never so struck by anything in my life. I even embodied it in a small brochure with the somewhat fantastic title of A Study in Scarlet. He shook his head sadly. I glanced over it, said he. Honestly, I cannot congratulate you upon it. Detection is, or ought to be, an exact science, and should be treated in the same cold and unemotional manner. You've attempted to tinge it with romanticism, which produces much the same effect as if you worked a love story or an elopement into the fifth proposition of Euclid.
That's very good. Well, and there's a lot going on in the time. If you look at the literature of the Victorian age, you find a very large number of very well-known examples of Victorian Gothic horror. You've got I think around 1860, it was Wilkie Collins with The Woman in White. Conan Doyle's friend Bram Stoker wrote Dracula in 1997. There was Sheridan Le Fanu. There was Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And it's an age where Victorians were obsessed with things like mourning rituals and mementos and mortality in general. And so you've got this, Gothic literature that is sort of romantic and sort of supernatural. And in the cases of Sherlock Holmes, you have a lot of examples of those sorts of Gothic elements. For example, the big one, of course, is Hound of the Baskervilles. But there's also many strange occurrences, things like the engineer's thumb And then out to Cornwall for the Devil's Foot, Radix Pedis Diaboli. You know, it just makes people completely insensate. And then Copper Beeches. You know, some of these cases, you know, it wouldn't be unusual for the indulgent reader to say, now, wait a minute. You mean to tell me this woman would really go out to the countryside and put on somebody else's dress and cut off her hair and sit in the window just because somebody asked her to sit near the window and put up with all this stuff, you know, including the strange little boy who's smashing cockroaches in the back? And you mean to tell me there was really this ferocious beast of a master? I mean, all of that just sounds a little bit like, you know, like Wuthering Beaches, not like Wuthering Heights, you know?
And yet, in the opening of that story, Holmes, he kind of waffles between complimenting Watson on his ability to select cases for a write-up, but also dings him on the actual write-ups. You know, he said, you know, to the man who loves art for its own sake, it's frequently in its least important and lowliest manifestations that the keenest pleasure is to be derived. It's pleasant for me to observe, Watson, that you so far have grasped this truth, that in these little records of our cases, which you have been good enough to draw up, and I am bound to say occasionally to embellish, you have given prominence, and not so much not so much to the many cause celebs and sensational trials which I have figured in, but rather those incidents which may have been trivial in themselves, but which have given room for those faculties of deduction and of logical synthesis which I have made my special province.
Interesting.
Yeah. But he says, you've erred, perhaps. You've erred, perhaps, in attempting to put color and life into each of your statements instead of confining yourself to the task of placing upon record that severe reasoning from the cause and effect, which is really the only notable feature about the thing. And they get into this back and forth. You know, Watson gets defensive about it. You know, it seems to have done Holmes full justice in the matter. And Holmes says, if I claim full justice for my art, it's because it's an impersonal thing, a thing beyond myself. Crime is common. Logic is rare. Therefore, it's upon the logic rather than upon the crime that you should dwell. You've degraded what should have been a course of lectures into a series of tales.
Yes, Holmes, a series of tales that pay very well. Because that's what people like to read. You insufferable investigator, you.
That's just it. But this here is Watson's understanding of what it takes to be a good storyteller. You know, he instinctively knew that the public wouldn't sit for some, mundane, boring recitation of a bunch of logical faculties. It was really about the drama and the romance he could create about it. And guess what? By the way, the logic and the deductions were part of that, but they weren't the central feature. That's not why people showed up.
Well, that's true. That's true. And there's lots of behaviors that Watson has and characteristics of his storytelling that can support the idea of embellishing. You know, for example, if I were to ask you how many unreported cases there are in the Sherlock Holmes canon, just cases that we don't hear anything more about that Watson mentions, how many would you say there are?
72.
Well, it's not a bad guess. There are actually 106. And so if you think about that...
Well, so under Price is Right rules, I still win.
Right.
I didn't go over.
Right. And it's a new Kia convertible. But it's an extraordinary number. You know, there are 56 short stories, 4 novels, and yet there is a much larger number of unreported cases that Watson has. And he has explanations, too, about why he writes up this case or that case. In the 5 Orange Pips, he says he considers 4 factors. In the introduction of the 5 Orange Pips, he says, well, some of Holmes's cases have gained publicity through the papers, and I'm not going to write about those because they're public. Others, he says, have not offered a field for those peculiar qualities which my friend possessed. So, in other words, didn't really test Holmes to his limits and have him really focus on things and see things that were really, really obscure only to him. He says some have baffled his analytical skill, and those would be beginnings without an ending. They just never went anywhere. And then he says others have been partially cleaned up and have their explanations founded upon conjecture and surmise rather than on absolute logical proof. And then he goes on to tell us about one, which is the 5 Orange Pips. And then later on in Thor Bridge, he says, I also think about these other things. I think about some of these involve secrets of private families. And so I can't put those in print because it would be a breach of confidence. And then he says, and there remain a considerable residue of cases of greater or less interest which I might have edited before had I not feared to give the public a surfeit which might react upon the reputation of the man of whom above all others I revere. So he doesn't want to write too much about Sherlock Holmes. He doesn't want to bore people. And then he says, in some I was either not present or I played so small a part that they could only be told as by a third person. So he seems to have this Niagara of reasons why he's not going to refer to this case and that case. And I don't know how well any of those things hold up.
Well, it's interesting because there is a story in which Holmes compliments Watson on his ability, his uncanny ability to tell which stories he's going to share. He said, he's talking about Hopkins, right? They were connected with Stanley Hopkins in the Abbey Grange. So I fancy every one of his cases has found its way into your collection. I must admit, Watson, you have some power of selection, which atones for much which I deplore in your narratives. So it's always the double-handed compliment there, compliment insult. Your fatal habit at looking at everything from the point of view of a story instead of a scientific exercise has ruined what might have been an instructive and even classical series of demonstrations. You slur over the work of the utmost finesse and delicacy in order to dwell upon sensational details which may excite but cannot possibly instruct the reader. And then, of course, Watson has that rejoinder. Well, why don't you write them yourself? And Holmes says, I will in my declining years.
And he does eventually.
Yeah, one or two.
Theoretically. Yeah. It is interesting. But, after all, it's popular magazines. We've got a new generation of readers in the Victorian age. You have the Strand magazine. This is really popular culture. And it's not unusual that a writer like Watson would be trying to fit the adventures of Sherlock. After all, they are called adventures. The cases of Sherlock Holmes into that pattern rather than the other way around.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Now, in terms of Watson's reliability as a narrator, I don't think we can necessarily say definitively that he changed something that was material to the case in order to reach a different conclusion. I mean, he obviously did change names didn't expose the dates. And obviously he, had to create some dialogue at some point. But I don't know if there's anything we can definitively say that, well, Watson wasn't reliable in his narration. He may have been sloppy in his observation, right? That was part of Holmes's criticism of him when he sent him to do some of his work. But I don't know.
Well, I think of two things. One is the Three Gables, and I've always questioned whether or not the this powerful, bewitching genius Isadora Klein really thought that the only way to get this manuscript would be to buy the entire house with all of its furnishings because poor Moms Maberly was going to be too slow or too stupid to actually open the suitcase and find it. And so, yeah, sure, I got a great idea. I'm going to buy the house and all the contents. That's a good thing to do. That's a little questionable, and I don't know. But in any case, it's just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes. Why do you not write them yourself?
I will, my dear Watson, I will. In my declining years,